Good morning. Still working on the 102. We are gluing down the felt to the turntable, or rather experimenting with gluing down the turntable felt. Don't know how that's going to work out. Hopefully well, because I don't have any blue turntable felt to use if it doesn't. Anyway, the question came up about playing later style records on these older machines with the heavier reproducers and tone arms and all that. A lot of it depends on how you play it, the needles you use, the machine itself, and the type of records that you're playing. Now, let's take, for instance, this Victor record, this label. This is the older style, before 1925. This is a solid core record, which means it's black shellac through and through. During World War II, they did start making records briefly that were plaster core, and this is actually technology that was used by the cheaper record manufacturers, the so-called dime store records, earlier on to save on materials and to save the customer a little bit of money and sell the record cheaper. They would just skin it with black shellac over a plaster core. Now, with a record like that, if you play it a lot with these heavy steel needles, and look at this, this is the heavy, even though this is a pot metal reproducer, this is heavy. It had to be, because on these earlier records, it had to press down into the groove in order to, to work. But later on, with electric amplification, the grooves aren't quite as deep. And with those dime store records, the thickness of the shellac is not very thick. So you could eventually cause some serious wear. Now, there are people that play 40s era records regularly, post 1935 records regularly on these machines. This machine was made to play those records. And that's what was available on the market. You bought a machine in 1935, you didn't go to the junk store and buy a handful of records from 1915 to play on it. You wanted the latest jazz and the latest records, and that's what you played. Continued to play, and 10, 15 years service life the machine might have had with you, you bought new records all the time. But back then, these records were available, brand new. They weren't that expensive. So if you wore a record out, you broke it, you went back to the record store and you bought another one. And the manufacturers knew this. They wanted you to buy more records. They didn't care if the records wore out, because the idea was to sell you another record, more money. So the machine that they sold you would keep making money for them. They knew after 1935, when they took the grit that this record has grit in its black shellac makeup that is intended to wear the needle itself, to conform it to the groove. All that grit wears the needles. It rides in the grooves. It wears the needle down. That disappears after 1935, and the needle can potentially start to wear the record. Probably not the first time, maybe not the first 50 times, but eventually it will, even in the highest quality, Victor or Decca or Columbia records, it will start to wear the record groove, eventually. And a lot of that depends on the machine you're playing it on. Yeah. A question I was asked is what kind of wind-up phonograph would be best to play these sorts of records without damaging them, the post-35 ones. And my answer to that would be the last ones. The very last wind-up phonographs made in the late 1950s and the early 60s, they were cheap junk, to be sure. But the tone arms were plastic. The reproducers were plastic. They worked. Do they sound as good as a 102? No. Or any Victor orthophonic? No, it's not going to. It's not going to sound as good as any Victor machine or a early HMV. But they do play, and that light tone armor reproducer are going to do the most minimal damage to the records because they're extremely lightweight. And if you use a small needle, it's even better. Even less damage. Potential for damage. Like there's been people did studies that, they've played records, say a 1940 Glenn Miller record or whatever, 100 times, and it didn't have any discernible wear to it. Playing, I'm not sure what machines they might have used, but you hear about studies like that now and then, but you don't know exactly what they were doing, what kind of needles they were using, and you may not have the same results. Maybe your record's already got wear on it, and the use you put it to is going to finish the job. It's done. I'll show you some later 40s records. I got one here somewhere. Let's see. I was going to play these later on this machine, but here we go. This is a Fat Squalor record, I think. This already has some wear on it. You can see it right here. See the discoloration there? That's not dirt. That's wear. That's record wear. So I'm not too worried about playing this particular record on one of these machines. It's already worn. But this is a good example, of a later 40s, post-war even. I'm not sure what era this was. It's the late 30s, early 40s. But this record, being Victor, RCA Victor in this case, does have a solid core. I don't believe this was made during the war. Looking down in there, it does look solid. It's hard to tell sometimes. But if this had a plaster core, one, never ever get it wet, because that plaster will swell, crack. When in doubt, don't clean a record. If you have any doubt as to what is inside that record, do not immerse it in water, get it wet, anything like that. Wipe it down with a very, very mildly damp cloth at best. That's the best you can do. Don't even trust chemical cleaners, because you don't know what that might do to the record. You could destroy it forever. When in doubt. But something like this I wouldn't worry about. This I know is solid core. Well, I'm pretty sure anyway. I'm not really sure about this one. Though the other Victor I am. The Victor Batwing labels, I am on those. Who knows how many times you can play this before it wears out. A few times, probably not going to hurt it. A few hundred times, probably will. So you really got to be careful and use your own judgment and be aware of the risks. No matter what anybody on the internet says or anywhere else, be aware there are risks and understand the differences in the very makeup of this type of record as compared to something from the early 20s. Early 20s, they were designed to play with heavy tone arms and heavy reproducers and big needles. They were designed for that. This record was designed to play on an electrically amplified machine with a very light plastic or pot metal stylus on there with a sapphire needle. That's what they were made to play with. That's what most people had by that time. So yeah, you can play it on a Victrola or one of this type of wind-up machine, but the potential is there for wear. So if there's a record you really value, I would say buy the CD and listen to it. Keep the record for one of the electric, a modern turntable to preserve it. If it's like this, go ahead and play it. I mean, it's already damaged. This is not, a rare record, and this is, in this condition, not particularly valuable. It's $1 at most. So, you can play it on your machine. This is what you have. But if it's a really pristine record, I really wouldn't. I would put that one aside and not take any risks with it. If you don't have an electric turntable, you can get one easier enough. One of those modern Victrolas, they call them, they're made in China. They have a CD player built into them and a turntable that will actually play 78s very well. So, that's a good machine to play these on if you need to listen to them. Not the highest quality maybe, but it'll work. We'll play that later and see what we can get out of it, which is probably not much. And we really got to be careful of Harmony. I don't know who made Harmony, if they were considered a dollar store. I'm not a record collector. I just keep records to play on the machines that I fix. It's the machines I like to play with. And it usually is the older acoustic records I'm playing with most, not really these. This could be a plaster core record. I would be just looking at the surface of it, I see little raises and bumps in it. It looks fairly cheap, but see, it says patented May 23rd. It could be an older one. I don't know. It has a detent on it, so no, it's not. It's post-1925. Just patented in 23. This is probably from the 30s. Anyway, something like this I would not give a water bath to wash it, even though it is a little dirty. Because you could ruin the record forever, and that's it. And then there's no more Manhattan Dance Makers. The Kalinda. We'll try that one later. So you got to be careful with those. Let's stick that back in there so we do not break it before we get a chance to play it. There we go. Oops. So do your homework on your records. Know what you have. And of course, it goes without saying, if your machine has not been serviced properly and the motor hasn't been cleaned and everything lubricated, the spring and everything else, and the reproducer doesn't have new gaskets, not every machine is like a 102, which has felt gaskets in the reproducer, so you're a lot safer with that one, unless a bug eats the felt. I've seen that happen. Unless a bug eats the felt in there, or you get corrosion holes in the diaphragm, you're pretty much okay. Everything else, though, has rubber gaskets in the reproducer, and they turn to stone over time. And when they turn to stone, the freedom of movement of the needle comes to a stop. I mean, the needle is just rigidly in there. The needle needs to move. It needs to move in a groove. You know, like doing this with the vibrations and all that. If it can't move, it turns into a cutting implement and will destroy your records eventually and sound terrible while you're at it. So if you haven't had the reproducer rebuilt or done it yourself and the whole machine serviced properly, you're going to cause damage to the records as you're playing them. You know, the machine's not it's varying its speed, it's jerking around, your reproducer's not moving properly, excuse me, and so you're going to have problems there too. So if you haven't serviced your machine, stop playing records on it and service it, or get it done. There's people that'll do it for you, they're not cheap. This is why I started servicing my own machines many, many years ago, because it was very expensive to get it done by someone who did it professionally. So, you know, I looked at this and said, you know, this is a mechanical device. It's not really that technically advanced. I think I could do this myself. And sure enough, it wasn't that big of a deal. I mastered it eventually. Anyway, that's the answer to the question about can I play the newer records on these older machines. Yes, you can, but there is risk. You need to be aware of risk. That's all. And if you find one of those cheap 1960s last of the era windups, you might want to try one of those. You know, if they're broken, just leave it alone. You're not going to find parts, and no one's going to want to fix it. And they're not really made to be fixed. They're throwaways, but they did have that plastic tone arm and reproducer. So that would be the best. All right, that's it for now. We'll be playing this later when I hopefully am able to glue the turntable felt back on. Right now it's glued and I got weights sitting on it to see if it'll stay. So